The Rambam famously starts a sefer with the words Yisoid ha-Yisoides v'amud ha-Chochma is the foundation of all foundation, the pillar of all wisdoms. Is Leida sheyesha motzi rishon is to know that there's a first being, a first existence, of course referring to Hashem. The Rambam goes on for about 5 halachos describing various different things that we need to know about Hashem. And then the Rambam concludes in halacha vav v'yedias davar zeh, knowing this is a mitzvah saseh, as it says, Anoichi Hashem Elokecha. Says the Rebbe, from this we understand that according to the Rambam, the mitzvah saseh of Anoichi is not only the general knowledge that Hashem exists, but also includes all of these details that the Rambam specifies and discusses about Hashem. Furthermore, says the Rebbe, the Rambam specifically says that the mitzvah is leida, to know that there is Hashem. Doesn't use the word lahamin, to believe, to know. And the Rebbe explains that this will tell us, this will help us understand why it is that the Rambam elaborates to explain many things regarding Hashem. Also in the further halachos, the Rambam goes on to prove that Hashem doesn't have a body, and the Rambam explains what it means when Moshe Rabbeinu wanted to know and ask Hashem, let me see your glory, etc., etc., etc. Because since the Rambam says the mitzvah is to know, it's to understand in a logical and rational way that Hashem exists and so on, so therefore it's not enough, again, just to have the general belief that Hashem exists, but rather we have to know it, and therefore we need to understand all these details that the Rambam is telling us. The Rebbe says that we can actually say that the source for the Rambam, again, in the 2 points. Number one, that the mitzvah is not only generally to know that Hashem exists, but also to understand many of the details about Hashem's perfection, Hashem's oneness, the way Hashem is the first being, etc., etc. And also that it needs to be in a way of das, in a way of properly understanding it and knowing it, not only belief, is actually based on the Zohar. The Rebbe goes through the Zohar, and it shows how many of the wording of the Rambam itself is very similar to the Zohar, and then shows how these 2 general ideas are within the Zohar. The Zohar says, on the pasuk v'yidatem ki ani Hashem, Moshe Rabbeinu tells the Yidden of Mitzrayim, and the name of Hashem, that you will know that I am Hashem. Says the Zohar that this mitzvah is the first mitzvah of all mitzvahs, to know Hashem, and to know that there's a supernal ruler, that He is the master of the world, He is the one that creates the worlds, everything from heaven to earth, and everything in between. So again, first of all, if we look into the Rambam, in that first halakha, it's very similar wording, but we also see these 2 ideas. Number one, that there needs to be a concept of das, we need to fully understand it, and also not just understanding it in a general way, but we also need to understand the details about Hashem's existence. Says the Rebbe, based on this, we could also explain another thing that seems a bit surprising in the Rambam. In the 2nd perek of Hilchos Yisoidei HaTorah, the Rambam starts discussing the idea of loving Hashem and fearing Hashem. The Rambam says, how do we come to love and fear Hashem? When a person meditates and thinks about all of Hashem's wondrous works and creations, etc., this brings him first to love Hashem, and then this also causes him to stand in awe of Hashem and fear Hashem, etc. Then the Rambam says that based on this, I'm going to explain some general ideas regarding the works of Hashem, which will help us appreciate and come to love Hashem and fear Hashem. The Rambam then spends 3 prakim discussing Hashem's amazing works. 1 perek, this is perek beis of Hilchos Yisoidei HaTorah. The Rambam is discussing the Malachim, and generally this perek, along with the first perek where the Rambam is discussing Hashem, is included in a general category called Maisa Merkava, where we're speaking about all spiritual and godly things. Well, first, and that's in perek Aleph, and then in perek beis about the Malachim, which are also spiritual beings. And then another 2 prakim about what the Rambam refers to as Maisa Bereshis, the works of creation, where the Rambam discusses the 4 elements and other things related, the sun, the moon, the stars, the planets, etc., physical things. And the question is, why are all of these details so relevant in a sefer that's primarily a sefer of halachos? Now, even though the Rambam says, yes, when we think about these things, this will get us to love Hashem, but the details of what we need to meditate and think about seemingly don't belong in the Sefer of Halacha. So the Rebbe says the explanation is that really all of these details that the Rambam is discussing about Maisa Merkava and Maisa Bereshis is not only a contemplation and meditation to bring us to love and fear of Hashem, but it's really all part of that mitzvah we were discussing earlier, Yedias Hashem. By knowing all of these amazing things that Hashem created, that itself helps us understand and prove the idea of the Creator, and that Hashem is the very, very first one, and that Hashem is the Almighty, etc., etc. In other words, as part of the mitzvah of Yedias Hashem, which we said Yedias Hashem means a rational and logical understanding about Hashem and how He's the most perfect, etc. In order to appreciate all of that, we need to learn all of these details as well. Says the Rebbe. So in other words, yes, it's true that Rambam is saying that it's part of Avas Hashem and Yiras Hashem, but it's primarily here as further elaboration in the things that we need for Yedias Hashem, for the knowledge of Hashem. Says the Rebbe, based on this, that Maisa Merkava and Maisa Bereshis are so important as part of Yedias Hashem, we're going to be able to explain now that Rebbe is moving now all the way to the end of the Rambam. In the end of Hilchas Malachim. In the last halacha, the Rambam says that in that time when Mashiach comes, the whole world's occupation will only be to know Hashem, and therefore, says the Rambam, the Yidden are going to be Chachamim Gdolim, very wise. V'yoidim dvarim astumim, they're going to know all the hidden things. V'yasigu das boirim, and understand the knowledge of the Creator, kifi koyach adam, according to the capacity of man. As the pasuk says, Kimol Oretz Deis Hashem, the world will be filled with the knowledge of Hashem. Kamayim layom chasim. So the Rebbe asks, first of all, what are these two ideas? V'yoidim dvarim astumim, knowing the hidden things. And second thing is v'yasigu das boirim, and be able to know the knowledge of the Creator, according to the capacity of man. The Rambam said that our whole occupation is going to be to know Hashem. And then the Rambam says these two things, knowing the hidden things and knowing the knowledge of the Creator. That sounds like it's both part of the knowledge of Hashem in some way. So what are these two different things? Also, why is it regarding the second one, v'yasigu das boirim, that you know the knowledge of the Creator, the Rambam adds according to the capacity of man. And finally, in the pasuk the Rambam brings, Kimol Oretz Deis Hashem, the world will be filled with the knowledge of Hashem, kamayim layom chasim. Why are these last words relevant, kamayim layom chasim? But based on what we explained earlier, that part of mitzvah Yedias Hashem, in order to understand and to know about Hashem, you also need to know what we call Maisa Merkava, about all the spiritual things and the godly things, or Maisa Bereshis, and the works of Hashem's creation. Says the Rebbe, we could say that these two expressions of the Rambam, Dvarim Hastumim and Yasigu Das Boirim, correspond to these two things. Dvarim Hastumim is referring to Maisa Bereshis. We're speaking about certain aspects within creation, which are also very, very deep, as the Rambam says, but at least we can have some sort of understanding about them. And that's why they're called Dvarim Hastumim. But then there's something else, V'yasigu Das Boirim, getting to know the knowledge of the Creator Himself, and that's Maisa Merkava. Says the Rebbe, even regarding Malachim, we don't properly understand what they are. How much more so Das Boirim, to be able to understand the knowledge of the Creator. So this is definitely, we don't have a proper understanding in it. And that's why the Rambam has to add, Kifi koyach adam, according to the capacity of man. Says the Rebbe, now we'll also understand why the Rambam finishes off the Sefer with Kamayim layom chasim. But by first prefacing another point. The Rambam himself emphasizes that there's a very, very big difference that between the way we understand Maisa Merkava and Maisa Bereshis. In fact, the Rambam says, when he's discussing Maisa Merkava and Maisa Bereshis, the Rambam says that everything we discussed in the Sefer about Maisa Bereshis is kemar medli, like a drop in the bucket. That means even though, yes, it's only a tiny drop, but it's nevertheless something that's in some way, be'erech, in some way proportionate to the bucket. But then regarding Maisa Merkava, the Rambam says that what we're discussing over here is like a little drop in the ocean. The ocean represents like something bleakful, completely disproportionate. In halacha we have an expression about the ocean, it's called mayim she'ein lohem soif. It's like mayim with no end. So in other words, it represents a concept of bleakful. And that's why the Rambam adds these words, kamayim liyom chasim, to emphasize this idea that even though, yes, we're going to have some sort of knowledge in Hashem, but nevertheless it remains completely beyond us, like that infinite amount of, or so to speak, infinite amount of water covering the sea. The Rebbe concludes with a Haira in regards to learning Maisa Merkava and Maisa Bereshis. And the Rebbe says, on the one hand, the Rambam put in these halachas in the very, very beginning of the Sefer. And the Rambam himself says that the things that are in the Sefer Hamada in this first sefer, we need to learn at the very beginning of all. These are the most important things. The Rambam says that this sefer is made kakoton kagodel for everyone. And yet, the Rambam writes that in these halachos regarding Ma'aser Merkava, Ma'aser Bereishis, the Rambam says that it's inappropriate l'tayil to stroll in Pardes. These 4 prakim are referred to as Pardes, as the orchard, the secrets of the Torah. Says the Rambam, it's not appropriate for someone to stroll through this unless he first filled himself up, so to speak, with bread and meat, the Rambam says, which refers to the halachis of that which is asur and that which is mutar. So how do these two things go together? On the one hand, the Rambam says we're not supposed to learn this before we're filled up with all other sorts of halachas, and yet the Rambam puts this at the very, very beginning of his sefer, which he says is for everyone. Says the Rebbe, we need to look at the Rambam's words that it's not appropriate l'tayil b'pardes, to stroll in the pardes. The word tiyul is usually associated with the type of stroll or walk that someone's doing for pleasure. In other words, really spending lots of time of it, getting very deeply involved in it, etc. This, says the Rebbe, that's what the Rambam means. To get involved in this type of learning, that's only after you learned lots of other things. But in the way they're brought in the Rambam itself, they're not brought with tremendous arichos. As the Rambam himself says, they're like a drop in the sea. And therefore it's not included in this problem of tiyul, of strolling in the pardes. And on the other hand, these things that the Rambam did put in, of course, they are absolutely crucial. The Rambam himself says that this is Yisoidi, HaYisoidis V'Amud HaChacham is the foundation of all foundation. The pillar of all wisdom is to have the idea, the knowledge in Elikus, which is by learning these prakim. Concludes the Rebbe that by being involved in all of these things now, will be zoicha very speedily. To Yemois HaMashiach, and the whole world will be filled with the knowledge of Hashem. And as the Rambam says, Kimol Oretz Deis Hashem, Kamayim Layom Mechasim.